Hello, my name is Bo Nelson, and I want to welcome you to another installment of the Have We Forgotten series. And this week, I want to ask a question that has its direct correlation to last week's question, which was, have we forgotten that the King is coming? And the question I want to lay before you in this session is this: have we forgotten how we should live in light of His return? There's an innate desire in every born-again believer to have intimacy with the King. In Psalm 16:11, it says, "In your presence is the fullness of joy, and in your right hand are pleasures forevermore." Jesus Christ in John 15, He says that my joy be in you, and your joy be made full. You see, our joy has a direct correlation to our intimacy with the King. And our intimacy is affected by how we live our lives. Sin separates man from God. And I'm not saying that we as believers can lose our salvation, for no man can lose his salvation, because that is a gift from the King that cannot be retracted. But what I am saying is our intimacy, our joy can be affected by how we live. The writer of the book of Hebrews says this in Hebrews 9:28. "So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for Him." So the question is how do you know that you're eagerly waiting for Him? How do you know that you are longing for intimacy with the King? How should we live in the here and the now as we wait in longing anticipation for the return of the King? Well, many of us live in routine. We focus on our jobs, our careers, our families, our schooling, our church activities. But if we're honest with ourselves, we aren't asking the question, if Jesus were to return today, will I have made the most of my time? Have we forgotten how we should live? Well, I want to offer you a couple considerations, a couple things that you can ask yourself to examine your life so that you can know that you're living in light of the return of the King. So here's the first consideration. Are you actively pursuing holiness and righteousness? Are you actively pursuing holiness and righteousness? It takes a lot of effort to be good at things in this life. Many people invest their entire lives to becoming good at sports, at music, friendships, you name it. But just as much effort as it takes to become good at those things, how much more effort does it take to shed the old man? You see, Paul gives us an illustration in 1 Corinthians 9:24-26 in his own mindset in growing in righteousness and holiness. He says this, he says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Peter in 2 Peter 1:5, he says, "Be diligent to add to your faith." That term diligence means to give every effort, maximum effort. Paul says in Titus 2:11 and 12, he says, "For the grace of God appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, godly lives in the present age." Hebrews 12:1 says, "Set aside every encumbrance and sin that so easily entangles us, and run the race with endurance, fixing our eyes on the author and perfecter of our faith, Jesus Christ." There is something imperative about us pursuing holiness and righteousness. The effort that we have to put forth has to be in its maximum capacity. In fact, beyond what we're capable. And it seems so daunting, but here's the good news, is we don't do this in our effort. Romans 8:12 says, "You're no longer obligated to the flesh to fulfill its desires, but by the power of the Spirit, putting the deeds of the flesh to death." Philippians 2:12 and 13 says, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling." For it is God who's at work in you to work and to will for His good pleasure. Believer, pursue holiness and righteousness because it's God who's at work in you to will and to work for it. Do not grow weary in doing good. Pursue holiness and righteousness with every fiber of your being. And what you will enjoy is intimacy with the King. And what this will produce in you is the second consideration. Are you growing in your usefulness? Going back to the 2 Peter passage, Peter in chapter 1, verse 5, he says, for this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith. And then he gives a list of 7 virtues. But listen to verse 8. He says, for if these qualities are yours and are increasing, they keep you from being ineffective or unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. If you are growing in holiness and righteousness, it makes you more useful to the King. I know we all want to be useful to the King, because there's a day coming where we're going to all come before Him in His presence. And He's either going to say, well done, my good and faithful servant, or He's not. We'll get in by the hairs of our chinny chin chin. May you give every effort to be found well-pleasing to Him, so that on that day, we step into the Master's realm and He says, well done, my good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your Master. May your ambition to be found ready when the King returns by pursuing holiness and righteousness and usefulness to the King. Next week, we're going to look at what does it mean to be useful to the King. And we're going to answer the question is, have we forgotten that we are His possession? So will you join me next week as we continue to develop this series and asking the question, have we forgotten? May you be blessed. May He be glorified.